Boa tarde,
Dave Snowden, you are live.
You are live.
Okay.
Hey, Mr. Snowden. Let me just introduce you a little bit to the people in Brazil, right? Welcome to Agile Path. We guys from Mooven are very excited about your attendance here. Make yourself comfortable from now, and please start speaking and let us know if you have any issue, okay?
Okay. So I've been asked to talk for about half an hour about organizational design and leave some time for questions at the end. There are a couple of things I should say up front on this. A lot of what I'm going to talk about has been published recently. I actually authored a field guide for the European Union on how to manage complexity in a crisis. And that contains a lot of the basic principles, and that material can be downloaded for free. It's an open PDF. We are going to be looking to translate that into Portuguese and Spanish and so on before too much longer. So as I say, that's available. So you've got that material, which will back you up, and I'll put the link in the chat so that people can pick that up. Yeah. The second thing is the general approach that I'm taking here, and this is developed over about 20 or 30 years. Just so you know my background, I started off with a degree in physics and philosophy, which I thought was an indulgence when I did it, but has proved quite useful since. Did a lot of work for the next 3 years in the World Council of Churches. I was actually in Sao Paulo during that period, working in the slum areas and so on, as well as Australia. And then ended up going through a sort of career pathway of HR, finance, and then strategy. And in the middle of that, I learned how to program computers, and I started to design decision support systems. So my background in IT is in decision support of executives in making complex decisions, and that's really carried on since. A lot of the stuff I'm going to talk about comes from after IBM bought the company, of which by then I was strategy director, and gave me a free role within IBM, by which they paid me a salary as long as I did interesting things. Big companies allow that sort of thing from time to time. And in the course of doing interesting things and upsetting a lot of senior executives, which I was also encouraged to do, which was good, I got pulled into a major US government DARPA program on counterterrorism before the tragic events of 9/11, and was actually in the Pentagon the night before 9/11. I picked up the news the next day after I'd flown back overnight to the UK. And things got quite serious over there. And the big thing we were focused on in counterterrorism was weak signal detection. So how do you understand things that with the benefit of hindsight, you realize are significant, but you don't see how significant they are at the time? So my background's like that. And about 20 years ago, the Singapore government approached me and asked me to leave IBM and gave me the sort of cash to build Cognitive Edge from scratch by effectively giving me the contract for their risk assessment and horizon scanning center. So we built and designed that. So that's the sort of background. Yeah. For those of you in the Agile community, I was one of the 3 founders of the DSDM consortium, which is one of the major feeds into the actual Agile manifesto itself. That was myself, my equivalent in Logica, and Ed from Cambridge, and we got together in a pub in Cheltenham for an evening and sorted it out. We were British, so a pub in the evening rather than a ski resort for a week. But yeah, that was one of the first attempts at methods for rapid application development and high levels of customer engagement. So it's been a mixed career, and I've moved around a lot, and that's actually proved quite useful. The theoretical background to this is called naturalizing sense making, and I'll define my terms there. So sense making, which I define with a hyphen, and just say academics have major fights over whether you use a hyphen or you don't use a hyphen. Most of you don't need to worry about that. I define sense making as how do we make sense of the world so that we can act in it. And with that comes a concept of sufficiency. It's also how do I know what sort of action I can make given what I actually know. And of course, you can't know everything you ever want to. So that concept of sense making is very action focused. The naturalizing comes from philosophy, and it means to root what you're doing in social systems in the natural sciences. Let's say part of my background is in theoretical physics. And from a physicist's point of view, no social scientist ever has enough data to form any valid conclusion. And in my personal experience, nobody who writes a popular management textbook ever has enough data to support any of the conclusions they come to anyway. So one of the things we start to do is to look at what do we know about human decision making, what do we know about systems from a scientific point of view, and then we apply that into things like organizational design. So I'll throw three basic facts out now just to get that started and then go through some of the implications. So the first is a thing called inattentional blindness. Famous experiments on this: if you give a group of radiologists a batch of x-rays and you ask them to look for anomalies, and on the final x-ray you put a picture of a gorilla which is 48 times the size of a cancer nodule, then on average 83% of radiologists will not see it even though their eyes physically scan it. And the 17% who do see it come to believe they were wrong when they talk with the 83% who did. I say this is called inattentional blindness. The reason it happens is the most we scan of available data before we make a decision is about 3 to 5%. That triggers a series of memories, both in our brain, our body, in our social interactions. It's a mix of those. And we blend those together into patterns. And the first pattern, which appears to fit the limited data scan, we apply. Now, in evolutionary terms, you can see why this happens. If you think about the early hominoids on the savannas of Africa, something large and yellow with very sharp teeth runs towards you at high speed. Do you want to autistically scan all available data, look up a catalogue of the flora and fauna of the African veldt, and having identified lion, look at best practice case studies on how to avoid lions? By the time you do that, the only book of any use to you will be the book of Jonah from the Old Testament, which is the only example I've found of how to escape from the digestive tract of a large carnivore written by a survivor. So we evolved to make decisions very, very quickly, privileging our most recent experiences based on a partial data scan. And once you realize that, there's a whole body of stuff in organizational design that needs to take account of that. And one of the key things there is, how do you find the 17%? How do you find the people who've seen something differently, who you need to focus on as an executive? And one of the ways we do that is distributed decision support through human sensor networks. This is one of the 3 mandated processes in the U Field Guide. So, for example, you would use the whole of your workforce, you would present a situation to them. You get them all to assess that situation in real time. And we use what's called high abstraction metadata. So they may associate what they say with pictures, with images, with text, which doesn't actually give them a chance to know what you want to hear. And that's the key. You want to see what they actually think rather than have them present what they want you to hear, which is a big issue for executives in terms of the way things work. And from that, we draw what look like contour maps, where if you have the contours are close together, it means you've got a very strong opinion, a very strong view. If the contours are far apart, it means the view is weaker. And generally, you'll find that different groups of the organization see things in a different way. And then also, you'll find these precious groups, these outlier groups, people who are seeing the world very differently from everybody else. And normally, you don't get access to them as an executive, but now you know who they are, you can go and ask them questions. Those are the people who've seen gorillas. And by the way, generally, and this comes from Gary Klein, and I fully endorse it, most of us now don't talk about this concept of a cognitive bias. We talk about cognitive heuristics. All these things which people call biases are because actually, in general, they work for people. And we just haven't got the energy time to do everything in a highly logical, highly structured way. And we haven't evolved to do that anyway, because we wouldn't have survived if we'd all been robots. So that's one example of the use of science. The second example I want to bring up is, and this is the key thing underneath the Cynefin framework and many other things, is the concept of complex adaptive systems theory, which is starting to displace systems thinking now, not just in the academic environment, but in business practice. And the best way to think about a complex adaptive system is to take the idea of entanglement. So everything is entwined with everything else. It's rather like if you go into a mangrove swamp, all of the roots of the mangrove trees, they're under the water, so you can't see them all anyway, and there's kind of like dangerous beasts there, so you can't investigate too much. But they're all entangled one with each other, and you can't separate the entanglement. And the key thing to understand about a complex system is that everything is connected in various ways with everything else, but you can't know the nature of the connections. And if you push on one part of the system, you can't predict what will happen as a result. So effectively, you haven't got the traditional linear relationship between cause and effect. You can't say, if I do this, I will get that result. So once we understand that, we start to shift to a model of complexity, which has a major influence on organizational design. So let me give you some examples, and I'll start with a biological metaphor. If you look at trees in a forest, they have deep root systems. And then those root systems are connected by the roots of fungi, and it's a symbiotic relationship. So the fungal roots actually extend something like 500 times the distance of the tree roots, and they're very fine and deeply entangled. So the symbiosis is they provide water and food to the trees, and the trees feed back sucrose in response. And people didn't know about this until fairly recently. And one of the reasons we have a problem with soil retention and soil health is the attempt to actually replace that fungal roots with things like nitrogen and so on. Now, the metaphor I'm making for that is the informal networks in organizations. So you can have the formal system, the trees, and the informal system of the fungal roots. Now, hold that concept because it's an important one. In some of the pioneering work I did when I worked for IBM, we looked at knowledge management and communities within IBM, i.e. people who work together around common issues or common problems. And we found that the ratio between formal and informal communities was something like 1:64. So for every formal structured community, which was visible to management, there are 64 plus communities who just use the technology casually to get things done. Remember, this is before social computing came along. These are the days of Lotus Notes and things like that. In fact, Lotus Notes was the mechanism we used for it in what were called team rooms or workrooms. Now, it was fascinating when I went to see the chief knowledge officer of IBM and explained this to her. She wanted to make them all formal. And that's a fundamental mistake, because informal networks cost you no energy or money. They're going to form anyway. So if we take the government of Singapore, for example, the informal networks form because they all do national service. So every Singapore civil servant has done 2 to 3 years in the army, often more. And they've built relationships with people in the officers' mess, in the sergeant's mess, by going on exercises together, by going back every year for their annual retraining for the first 10 or 15 years after they leave and so on. So you have a deeply networked civil service where most people are within 2 to 3 degrees of separation of everybody else, based on a trusted relationship of having to work together. Now, if you contrast that with the British political system, the informal networks effectively arise from people who went to 2 or 3 elite schools and 1 or 2 elite universities. And so those are actually quite perverted as networks because they're too limited, whereas the Singapore ones are quite democratic. So one of the key things on organizational design, and to be honest, this is far more important than the formal structures, is to build the informal networks, the fungal roots that will connect the formal systems, and to get everybody to within 3 degrees of separation of everybody else. And if you go onto our open source wiki, because all of our methods are open source, that wiki is Cynefin.io, you'll find 2 methods described there. One is social network stimulation and the other is entangled trios. And those are formal methods, which actually run very quickly, which have other purposes. So, for example, in entangled trios, we put together people in groups of 3. We give them tasks that they think relevant, like lessons learned during COVID is one of the current ones. And then every 2 to 3 months, we break the 3s up and put people into different 3s. And after 6 to 9 months, everybody is within 2 or 3 degrees of separation of everybody else. And they've also done something they found useful. And what we're doing is to build a healthy level of entanglement, because we know that complex systems are entangled. So if we can design the entanglement, we're going to be able to make better use of it. And that means that things will flow quickly. And since we published the EU Field Guide, I've done over 100 interviews with C-level executives. And one of the key things they all said at the end of the day was what really mattered was their informal networks. So to give you the academic reason for this, is an informal network arose for a purpose separate from work itself. So it's a context-free information channel, whereas the formal organization is a context-specific information channel. So as long as things stay stable, the formal system will work. But when things become unstable, it doesn't work anymore, or it takes too long to adapt. So people fall back into the informal network, which is there anyway on a day-to-day basis. So one of the first and key aspects I want to mention in organizational design is this question of building something which connects people informally across the silos. And you can measure the density of that network is one measure of organizational health. And by the way, informal networks are much better at problem solving than formal systems, because they work much faster in terms of the way they work. And I've emphasized that up front because people tend to start organizational design with a formal system. They draw a hierarchy or they draw a structure. They don't start with the informal network. And actually, my own company, Cognitive Edge, is now organized in this way. So every function within the company has 3 people responsible for it. If all the 3 people are agreed, then the decision is made. There's no need to go up or down a hierarchy. It's just made. And all of those groups of 3, there's always at least one person overlapping with the other groups. So the system is deeply connected and everybody knows what's going on. And we got very few degrees of separation as a result. So as CEO stroke CSO, I only get involved if the system can't manage things, and I don't actually direct anything other than sort of strategic level work in terms of the way we work. And by the way, we partly developed that because in one organization, we've been dealing with the total horror of techniques like holacracy, which is just nothing but another bureaucratic approach when you see it in practice. So informal networks, don't try and get rid of silos, build networks across silos is kind of like lesson number 1. And that links in with complexity theory. The other thing is the sort of big debate about the degree to which you need hierarchies anyway. And one of the things I would say from the work we've done is that you need to actually have a formal hierarchy. There needs to be, everybody needs to know somebody is ultimately responsible for them within the system. Too many levels of hierarchy, you've got a problem. And part of the problem with things like matrix structures is you end up with 2 competing hierarchies and nobody takes responsibility. Remember, that was an IBM. We had 3 matrix. And if you wanted to get promoted or you want, your pay and conditions examined, everybody could blame somebody else in that matrix. Nobody would take individual responsibility. So hierarchies are important for a whole body of purposes, but they shouldn't be the only organizational form. The other sort of question on this is, do you organize around the people or do you find the people to fit the roles? And I think hasn't got a single answer. And I've done 3 startups in my life, 2 within companies, which are actually harder than outside of companies, and now Cognitive Edge. And when you find good people in small companies, you build roles around them. As you get much bigger, you can't afford to do that except in a very narrow band, and you have to recruit people to find the roles. So role definition can be task-based as well as function-based. And the balance between task-based and function-based really depends on how much you're based on products, how much you're based on continuous service. There isn't a single answer to that, and there won't be a universal structure. In fact, your innovation teams are likely to be cross-silo project-based teams, whereas your customer service teams are probably more likely to sit within the traditional hierarchy. And there's an organizational form there which is used extensively in the military, which we've also built into our own approach, which is called a crew. So what happens in a crew, it's not the same thing as a team. It doesn't need to go through forming, norming, storming, and performing, or any of that stuff, because everybody is trained in a role and the expectation of the other roles. So if you go into an aircraft, it's got a crew. It's got a pilot, a navigator, a head steward, and so on. And they all know their roles, and they know the communication protocols between those roles. So you can actually, provided people have the right training, you can assemble a crew with people who've never worked together before without the overhead that comes with team formation. And operating the theatre is similar in the hospital. You know, if you're trained as a nurse within a operating team, you know, you're a surgery, you're a theatre nurse, then when the surgeon puts up their hand in a certain type of operation, you know what to put into it. And the surgeon can expect that in terms of the way it works. So crews have cognitive capability, which is more than the sum of the individuals. And it's no coincidence that they're used extensively in military groups, firefighting groups, and other people. So there's a longer training overhead. That's where the price comes in. But once you have people trained in roles, and most people are trained in one or two roles, you can assemble people very, very quickly without the need for team formation. And I've been arguing for some time that one of the things we could do within the Agile community is move beyond fairly crude functions like Scrum Master and work to a finer grained level of role and start to create training and other programs around that for interoperability. So a crew is a very valuable form of organizational structure, and it's another way of handling those different things across the silos. And you can do it both short-term and long-term in terms of the way it works. So again, you can see where I'm coming from on this. I'm trying to move into what type of things do you need people to do? Let's choose an organizational form appropriate for that, but with an overall scaffolding, an underlying structure of a hierarchy and silos, because those haven't been around for thousands of years for no reason. It's because actually they work. We just need to do other stuff as well. And self-organization, by the way, then becomes quite interesting, because you can allow people to self-organize into roles, but you don't just allow them to meet with people they want to meet with. They have to actually meet based on heuristics or command levels. And that really leads me on to the final science. And this is kind of like where we get started with organizational design. And this idea comes from Constructor Theory in physics, which is one of the first attempts in physics not to understand things by decomposing things to the lowest possible particle. Now, I thought they'd gone far enough with quarks, to be honest, but they're going even lower than that. But to actually understand the system as a whole. And the way constructor theory works, and this is my modification of it for human systems, is you start by defining what's called the counterfactual universe. So you define what isn't possible. And of course, what isn't possible may change over time. So there may be certain features of the organization based on the personal prejudices and biases of your CEO. And you know you're not going to be able to change those in the next 6 to 9 months. So that's a counterfactual. You just got to work within it. It's a boundary condition. And then once you've mapped what isn't possible, and you've mapped the degree to which it might be possible to change it over the time, or the point to which you might be able to weaken it or strengthen it, both are valid. And that's a process called Constraint Mapping, which again is defined in the EU handbook and on the field guide. Then you look at what you can do within that space, and these are called constructors. So mechanisms which will produce replicable results. Now, I've given you some ideas on that. So for example, crews and entangled trios, those are types of constructor. It means you're not defining exactly what will happen at the end of the day, but you're creating something which will evolve fairly quickly to produce a consistent, usable result within the system. And that has major implications, not just for organizational design, but also within organizations for things like the way, for example, you organize an IT department, the degree to which you allow co-evolution with user groups within the structure. So to give you an example of one method we developed to increase the interaction between developers and users, instead of having a systems analyst go out and interview everybody and then write up a series of story points and put it on the backlog and all of that good thing, what we actually did instead was to create 3 roles. This is a type of entangled trio. A young, bright, just out of college coder, naive, innocent, but right up to date and really fast. An experienced person like a systems architect or a systems tester. Testers are actually really useful in this and then neglected in the design stage of software. So we couple them together. This is called a sort of transgenerational pair is the technical name for it. And then we put them into a group of 3 with a user trained to talk to IT people. And by the way, it's a lot easier to train users to talk to IT people. In fact, we're going to be making that a virtual course shortly. So you can create a cadre of users who understand enough about IT to communicate what they need, rather than the other way around, which is more pragmatic. So I can define that as a threesome. But then I create 10, 15, 20, 50 of those threesomes, give them a couple of hours a week and get them to generate prototypes and ideas for the new system. And then I integrate all of that data together into what will then go into the system requirement. And one of the things that's really good at is identifying unarticulated needs in users. And if you can match existing technology to unarticulated needs, you can make a huge difference. Now, you'll notice that one of the things I haven't talked about is common missions, common goals, common value systems, common purpose, and common culture. And the reason is most of that is, to be quite honest, a bunch of nonsense. It sort of came out of systems thinking, and the concept, the only way to handle complexity was to have everybody aligned behind a common set of goals. Now, the reality is, I mean, I've been through thousands of these sessions over the years. I've been through mission statements, value statements, and purpose statements. There's no difference between a purpose statement and a mission statement. It's just the consultants stopped making money out of one, so they called it something different. There's only so many ways you can say we will be customer orientated or we will be an ethical company, and they're good words on butcher paper, but everybody knows them, everybody's familiar with them. We take a fairly radically different approach. First of all, coming back to that point about counterfactuals, we focus on defining what we don't want to be rather than what we do want to be. It's much easier to get agreement on the negative than the positive. And if you think about the stories you tell your children before they go to bed at night, fairy stories are actually negative, not positive. That's until Disney gets hold of them. And the reason that they're negative is you get more learning and more agreement about the negative side of things than the positive side of the world. And so kind of like negative stories create a boundary, a counterfactual that people won't go beyond. And then within that structure, we create ambiguous, they're called aporia, if you want the technical name, or parables, if you want the common name. So ambiguous stories which give people a sense of direction, and which they can't actually escape because the stories tell the purpose. One of the examples I use frequently for people in a Christian culture is the parable of the Good Samaritan, which has high levels of ambiguity in it and kind of like gives you an indication of what you shouldn't do, but doesn't tell you exactly what you should do. It gives you lots of options. And that's the key lesson from complexity. And this is the thing I want to leave you with, and now I'll open up for questions, is once you understand complexity, it becomes far more important to map the present and identify what's called an adjacent possible, the next step I can take. And if you want a good illustration of that, and one of the best movies ever to understand complexity is Disney's Frozen 2. And in that, the younger sister, I think, is the true heroine, not the one with all the magic. She hasn't did the hard work. She sings this wonderful song, "Do the Next Right Thing." All right? And that's the message for complexity. It's Frozen 2. What's the next right thing? Go and do it, then look again and see. So we start journeys with a sense of direction rather than trying to achieve specific goals.
That's a good question. Very good question, Mr. Snowden. Thank you for your words. And I am learning, I confess you that I'm learning a lot hearing from you, right? About informal networks and the importance, but not the importance of hierarchy. So it's important, but you should use other ways to manage people, right? And also the crew. I never thought about this type of organization of that sounds really pretty reasonable for me. So we have some questions here, and I would like to ask. I'm going to say them in Portuguese and then translate them to you. And then after you respond me, I'll translate it in Portuguese for the people, okay?
A bit short then. Yeah.
Pessoal, eu vou fazer as perguntas agora para ele, a gente já tem algumas, fiquem à vontade para mandar mais perguntas se vocês tiverem, tá? A primeira pergunta que a gente tem aqui está relacionada com como que o Dave Snowden, como ele lida com empresas que orientam o trabalho de acordo com o sistema óbvio ou ordenado, né? Mas na verdade elas estão gerenciando sistemas complicados ou complexos. Mr. Snowden, how do you deal with companies that orient their work according to the ordered system, but they are actually, in fact, managing complicated or complex systems?
I mean, one of there's a key lesson here. Start with where people are, not where you would like them to be. So if that's the type of company you've got, there's a standard question we ask, which is we try and find the intractable problems. Yeah, so I'll give you two approaches. One is intractable problem mapping. Now, a common phrase for intractable is wicked, but I think intractable is a better word. It means problems they've got, which they've had for a long time, that they can't find solutions to. And that's where you use your complexity techniques. You don't need to talk about complexity, but you show them there are different ways of working around that. So that's one very effective technique. The other one, which we're just doing actually with a North American organization, is you present the situation to the whole, a description by the board of the whole situation to the whole workforce. And we get them all to interpret that situation and identify scenarios. And then we show executives maps which show how different parts of the organization see the world in completely different ways. And we ask them what they think it means. So the key thing is for them to discover the need for complexity themselves rather than you trying to ram it in their faces.
Okay, let me translate it to them. Pessoal, ele disse que para resolver esse problema a gente precisa primeiro, antes de tudo, né, começa por onde as pessoas estão e não por onde elas acham que vão chegar, né? E a ferramenta que ele sugere aqui é um mapeamento, é um mapa dos problemas, e na sequência, na medida em que você vai mapeando e vai trabalhando com as pessoas, elas conseguem, e isso é fundamental, você trabalhar junto com as pessoas para garantir que elas entendem e convivem com não só convivem, como entendem aqueles problemas e trazem os insights para serem resolvidos. E aí você descobre exatamente onde, em qual sistema que as equipes realmente estão. Beleza? A segunda pergunta que eu vou fazer para ele está relacionada com os subdomínios do Cynefin. Quando que ele vai divulgar mais informações, ou quando eles vão falar sobre mais informações sobre os subdomínios. Mr. Snowden, when are you going to release more information, or are you intending to release more information related to the subdomains of Cynefin?
Yeah, yes, it's on my task to do this month, or probably September. So you'll see me do that on the blog.
Well, very good.
I've got to update the 3x3 matrices, and I will be doing that on the blog. Yeah.
Ok, thank you. Então, ele vai divulgar essas informações sobre os subdomínios em setembro, e a gente vai ficar sabendo pelo blog dele. Legal, né? Agora, a próxima pergunta que eu vou fazer para ele é sobre, que chegou aqui para mim, para falar sobre as estratégias corporativas nessa pandemia, né? Como que as empresas devem trabalhar ou deveriam ter trabalhado para lidar com a imprevisibilidade dessa pandemia. Mr. Snowden, can you talk more about how the corporate strategies in this pandemic? Let me try to clear it up for you. How did the companies should work to deal with imprevisibility?
So how should the companies work to what?
How should the companies should work to deal with imprevisibility?
Okay, so the last
Unpredictability.
word I'm not getting, so spell it.
Unpredictability.
Oh, unpredictability, right, I've got it. The EU Field Guide basically has, and it's all in the Field Guide, it has 4 stages you go through. Yeah, assess, are you really in a crisis or not, because you may not be. If you are, adapt quickly by changing the way you work. Then you accept, you start to repurpose existing capability to deal with the current crisis. And then and only then you focus on transcending the position and moving forward. And within that, we have these key concepts of, engage the whole workforce, build informal networks, which I've talked about. And you also need to create knowledge maps so you know what you know at the right level of granularity to repurpose. Now, if anybody's interested in that, we'll be launching shortly an assessment process, and that will be translated into Portuguese. An assessment process for organizations to map what they did against the field guide and to identify where they should go next.
Ok, thank you. Pessoal, ele respondeu que vai divulgar, né, um assessment traduzido para português, e ele está para ser divulgado em breve aqui no Brasil. Tudo bem? Sobre como que as empresas devem trabalhar para gerenciar a imprevisibilidade. Ok? Nós temos mais alguma pergunta, pessoal? Deixa eu... aqui tem uma pergunta, né? Se tem a possibilidade de trabalhar com o caótico, mesmo depois de sair dele. Sérgio Wanke Miller. Is that question okay for you, Mr. Snowden?
Yeah, I mean, the whole point about if you find yourself in chaos is you have to act decisively to exit it. Now, the key thing to understand about this is you don't act to solve the problem, you act to give yourself options for the future. That's a key principle. So if you look at COVID, and shall we just say that Brazil, Sweden, the UK and the US did very badly on COVID, whereas other countries like New Zealand did very well. What New Zealand did is they locked down, actually illegally. Their law didn't allow them to do it, but they locked down very, very fast. And that made the options were wider as they started to move to resolve the crisis. So in a chaotic environment, you take, if necessary, draconian actions very quickly to create a degree of stability. But critically, you focus on actions which will leave as many options open as possible. And then you start to identify what's ordered, what's complex, what's liminal, and so on within that. And that's the process. In the EU Field Guide, if you look at that, it's called the aporetic turn. So it's shifting from effectively chaotic into aporetic, which is a central domain of Cynefin. And aporia mean an unresolved question. That's the meaning of the word.
Okay. Thank you so much. There's another question here. Ian McDonald. I think you know this guy, right?
Yeah, he's been around a bit. Yeah.
Yeah, please go on.
Yeah, and this is actually about to run in Portuguese, and I'll be teaching on it. I think the rewilding Agile, the rewilding concept is an important one, because it doesn't mean to restore to the original, it means to restore balance. And the argument within Agile is that with things like SAFe and with the method wars, we've lost the original agility, we've lost the novelty, everything has become highly structured and highly commodified. So there was more or less a universal agreement on that, which was kind of like good news, right? And that was where we went through some of the methods and tools. I just talked about trios to understand user requirements. We talked about several others. And that's a course which will take you through that. The other big aspect of it, which we started to focus on, is what are called the 3 A's, which is assemblages, affordances, and agencies. So just explain that briefly. And you can get Ian to translate it because he should understand this, and then you can test him on it if you want, right? So affordance is what's available to you. Yeah, there's no point in having wonderful aspirations about what you want to be as a group. Affordance says, what can we do next? Assemblage is the pattern of belief or attitude which will determine what you're able to see. And agency is the amount of action independence that you have as an individual or a group. So mapping those 3 is key to understanding what's possible. There was a lot of other stuff, but as I say, it's a 3 full-day course or a distributed course, so there's lots to learn in it.
Okay, thank you so much. Do we have any question? Any other questions? Tem mais alguma pergunta, pessoal? I think we don't have any further questions. So we are very, as I told you in the beginning, we are very excited to have you here. And it was a pleasure for me to talk to you and help you bring this enormous content for us. Okay, so thank you so much for your presentation, and we'll see you soon.
Great.
Bye-bye.
I would love to come back to Brazil.
Well,
okay. Thank you.
Thank you.